Mendel quick vocabulary. Okay, a gene is what define a trait, what a physical person trait is. The location where a gene is found, for example, like here or anywhere else in the chromosome, is called the locus, a location where the gene is found. This is a diagram scientists use to determine the probability of the offspring. For example, you have two purple plants, and when you fertilize them, what will the chances of the children will be? So probability are the chances of what the children will be. So this diagram, in order to determine what the offspring will be, is called a Punnett square. It's what scientists use, what Mendel used to determine. Now this is dealing with one trait. For example, we're just dealing with color for now. So this we call is a monohybrid cross. We're making a cross between two heterozygous parents, and since we're dealing with only one trait, mono being one, hybrid is mixed. We're dealing with a cross where it's only one mix. This, on the other hand, has two traits. It has both shape and color, like round or wrinkle, and color is yellow or green. So it's two. So we're dealing with what is called a dihybrid cross. Now the gene we're dealing with right here is dealing with color, and the alleles is either purple or white. So alleles are different form of a gene. Now notice how each parent give off an allele, and the allele is 50-50 or whatever percent. The parents give off one of each allele. The allele, they separate. I mean, you don't give both allele at the same time. You have to give half of your allele. The other parents give half of their allele, so that way the offspring will have both alleles together, making it a two full allele, rather than having more than one. I mean, more than two, which is bad. So each parent give off half, so that's why you're 50 like your mom and 50 like your dad. So when these alleles separate, it applies with Mendel's first law. Mendel came up with a law states that the law of segregation. So during meiosis, after fertilization, the alleles, they must separate. By nature, the allele must separate. Now, the question is, why do we bother with recessive? For example, why do you even have recessive color white flowers, for example? Why don't we just have all dominant? Why don't we just be all purple and make it simpler in life? Why do we even bother with recessive? Why do we even bother, like, for example, certain disease are recessive, or there are certain things that are recessive that are not good? Like, what about like short versus tall? Short being recessive. Why don't just all organisms just be tall and make life simpler? Well, it comes to evolution, for example, like let's say there's a field of flower, and let's say if all the flower was purple, and then comes an organism that loves purple flower, what it's going to do is going to eat all the purple flower, and then all the flowers is the population of flowers for purple is going to be gone. See, now whereas if it has white, so in this case it has white as a recessive, the organism might eat all the purple flower, but some of the white flowers survive, and they're going to pass the gene on, and then later on it's going to be creating purple flower again, carrying the gene passed on to the next generation. So being recessive and dominant is basically having two choices, so that way if evolution ever occur, whichever one is more favored, that one will survive, rather than being just one. It's better if you're multi-talented rather than being just good with one, because the more you are, the better chance of whenever you're dealing with certain things. Like for example, in this case, recessive is still carried on to the next generation, because along the way the situation might change evolution wise, and then the organism will evolve accordingly. Okay, so that's the law of segregation. Now, for example, when we're dealing with shape and color at the same time, notice that the shape and color are not linked. By that we mean, for example, the first one is round and yellow, and then the second is round and green. But it can also be wrinkle and yellow, and it can also be wrinkle and green. So for example, just because it's round doesn't mean it's always going to be yellow. It can be round, or it can be yellow or green. Right? And then for wrinkle, it can be yellow or green. So in other words, the allele for round is not linked with wrinkle. I mean, it's not linked with any color like yellow or green. So it's the same thing as with human, for example, someone who is tall. Does that person who is tall means they're smart right away? That's not necessarily true. They could be smart or dumb, and then someone who is short can be smart or dumb. So that mean that the allele, when they separate, they also separate independently. They're not linked together. This not link, they separate independently, it leads to Mendel's second law, his law of independent assortment. Independent assortment, that means they separate independently of one another. When you're round, you can be round and yellow, or you can be round and green. It doesn't mean that, oh, because you're round you have to be yellow. So the alleles separate and they independently separate by themselves. They're not linked together. The word dependent means relying on other. The word in front of a word, it means not. So not relying on each other, and assortment means to distribute. So these alleles are being distributed evenly, and they're not going together. They're distribute randomly, kind of very independent of one another. They're not relying on one another. They don't go together. When one allele masks another allele, it's called dominant. In this case, the big B is dominant. So whenever the big B exists, the phenotype, the physical trait of the flower is always going to be purple. As long as there is a big B in the gene, then it will be purple. Now the one that is being masked is called recessive. That's the small b. The small b will only show up if there's no big B around. Brave wife. A husband and wife enter the dentist's office. The wife says, I want a tooth pulled. I don't want gas or Novocaine because I'm in a terrible hurry. Just pull the tooth as quickly as possible. Wow, you're a brave woman, said the dentist. Now, show me which tooth it is. The wife turns to her husband and says, Open your mouth and show the dentist which tooth it is, dear. So, what would you do if you find $100 on the ground?